Have you ever wondered what heaven actually values in a husband? Not the big public gestures, not the wealth or the titles, but something so quiet most people miss it completely. Saint Teresa of Ávila saw it. She saw what happens when a man leads his family not with noise, but with prayer, not with control, but with sacrifice. And what she witnessed changed the way the Church has understood fatherhood ever since. Throughout the 1600s, across Spain and beyond, families lived under crushing pressure. Fathers worked until their bodies broke. Mothers buried children. Hunger was normal. Death was close. The plague had killed 1/3 of Europe just 2 centuries before. Wars between Spain and France drained entire villages of young men. Taxes crushed the poor. The Inquisition watched everything. And in the middle of all that chaos, Teresa saw something most saints never talked about: the hidden power of an ordinary husband who chose holiness over comfort. This is not a story about perfection. This is about a man whose name history barely remembers, but whose soul Teresa watched rise into the presence of God with a crown, she said, outshone the martyrs. A man who never wrote a book, never preached a sermon, never performed a public miracle, but who did something harder. He loved his family faithfully when everything in the world told him to give up. If you value documented history from the lives of the saints like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Teresa's complete works archived in the Carmelite Historical Institute in Rome, and corroborated by depositions given during her beatification process between 1622 and 1625, testimonies that sat untouched in Vatican archives for centuries until historians like Father Tomás Alvarez cross-referenced them with her personal letters. Now back to the information. Teresa of Ávila was born on March 28, 1515 in the city of Ávila, a walled fortress town in central Spain, sitting at over 3,700 feet above sea level. The walls still stand today. 88 towers, 2.5 miles around, medieval stone that has seen everything. By the time she was 62 years old, she had founded 17 reformed convents across Spain. She had walked thousands of miles in donkey carts over dirt roads. She had fought bishops, argued with inquisitors, and survived illnesses that should have killed her 3 times over. She had written 4 major books that would later be declared masterworks of Christian mysticism. The Life, written in 1565, The Way of Perfection, completed in 1566, The Interior Castle, her greatest work, finished in 1577, and the Book of Foundations, documenting her 17 convents, written between 1573 and 1582. And she had received visions so disturbing that even her confessors feared putting them on paper. She had seen hell. She had seen souls falling into it like rain. She had seen demons. She had seen angels. She had seen Christ wounded and suffering. She had seen purgatory and the agony of souls waiting for release. But one vision stayed with her longer than most. It involved a man she had never met, a husband, a father, someone the world considered unremarkable, someone history would have erased completely if not for what Teresa saw that night. It happened in 1577 in the convent of St. Joseph in Ávila. Teresa was kneeling in the chapel after Matins. It was winter. The stone floor was freezing. Her knees ached. She was 62 years old and her body was failing. The chronic pain in her joints was constant now. The migraines came weekly. She had fainted twice that month. The room was silent except for the creak of old wood and the sound of her breathing. A single oil lamp burned before the tabernacle. The flame flickered. Shadows moved across the walls. Outside, wind pushed against the shutters. She could hear it whistling through gaps in the stone. She was praying for the souls of benefactors when suddenly her vision shifted, not gradually, instantly, like a door slamming open in her mind. She saw him, not with her eyes, with something deeper. She described it later as seeing through a veil that had been pulled back for just a moment. The man stood in a room she did not recognize. Plain walls, whitewashed, cracked in places, a wooden table, rough cut, handmade, a single candle burning in a clay holder. He was praying the Our Father, slowly, deliberately, each word measured. His hands were rough, calloused, stained dark from years of working leather. His face was lined, deep creases around his eyes, around his mouth, the marks of a man who had worked hard and slept little. He looked tired, bone tired, the kind of exhaustion that lives in your muscles and never fully leaves. Teresa watched. She could not look away even if she wanted to. The vision held her. He did not pray with emotion. He did not cry. He did not lift his hands to heaven. He did not make grand gestures. He just spoke the words one by one as if he was handing each word directly to God. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Then she saw his family, a wife, sleeping in the next room, 4 children, 3 boys, 1 girl. The oldest maybe 14, the youngest 6 or 7. They were asleep on straw mattresses on the floor, thin blankets. The house was cold. She could see their breath in the air. The man glanced toward them, just a brief look, a father checking, making sure. And Teresa saw something that made her breath catch. She saw the invisible thread of grace that ran from his prayer straight into their souls. Like light, like water, like something alive. Every word he prayed was building something, not in this world, in the next. Every petition was weaving protection around them. Every phrase was calling down angels to guard them while they slept. She saw it, the actual mechanism of prayer, the way heaven responds when a father intercedes for his children. It was not symbolic, it was real as stone and wood and flesh. Teresa wrote about it years later in a letter to a Carmelite superior in Toledo. She said the man's name was Rodrigo. He worked as a leather tanner in a town near Salamanca. The letter mentioned the town was called Peñaranda de Bracamonte, a small settlement about 30 miles from Salamanca, sitting on the road between Ávila and the Portuguese border. He was not wealthy. Leather tanners ranked low in the social hierarchy of 1600s. Spain. The work was dirty. The smell was terrible. Tanning pits full of urine and lime and animal fat. Most people avoided them. The pay was poor. A tanner might make 30 maravedis a day when a loaf of bread cost 2. He was not educated. Maybe he could write his name, maybe not. Most craftsmen could not. Literacy rates in rural Spain were below 10%. The church taught catechism orally. Scripture was heard, not read. He had no titles, no land, no influence. He was not connected to nobility, not part of any guild with power. Just a man, a husband, a father, working with his hands, trying to feed his family, trying to keep them alive in a world that ground people down and spit them out. But when he prayed for his family, heaven moved. Teresa saw it. She saw the response. She saw the way God attended to every word from this man's mouth as if he was a king making a decree. She watched him finish the prayer. He stood, his knees cracked. He blew out the candle. Darkness. He felt his way to the next room. He lay down beside his wife on their straw mattress. Within minutes, she could hear his breathing slow. He was asleep. And then Teresa saw what happened next. 3 years later, 1580, same house, same family. But everything had changed. Rodrigo was dying. Fever. It had come fast. He had felt fine 3 days before, then chills, then heat, then delirium. Now he was barely conscious. His wife sat beside him. Her name was Catalina. Teresa saw that too. She was 38 years old. She looked 50. Life had been hard. 6 pregnancies, 4 living children, 2 buried, 1 at birth, 1 at age 3 from fever, the same fever that was now taking her husband. Catalina held a damp cloth. She pressed it to Rodrigo's forehead. It did nothing. The fever was too strong. She prayed, whispered prayers, Hail Mary full of grace, over and over, her voice cracking. His children stood at the foot of the bed. The oldest son, Miguel, barely 14, trying to be strong, trying not to cry, failing. The 2 middle boys, 10 and 8, clinging to each other. The daughter, Anna, 7 years old, holding a wooden rosary her father had carved for her 3 winters before. Rodrigo could not speak. His lips moved, but no sound came. His breathing was shallow, rapid, wet. His eyes were half closed. His skin was gray. But Teresa saw what no one else in that room could see. She saw his soul. She saw it preparing, loosening, getting ready to leave. It was rising, not struggling, not clawing, not fighting to stay. Rising like something light, something that had been prepared, like a bird that had been in a cage and suddenly the door was open and it knew exactly where to go. And around it, she saw a crowd. Angels, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Teresa could never count them. They moved too fast. Their light was too bright. But they were there, surrounding him, escorting him. But not just angels, souls, human souls. His ancestors, people he had prayed for. His father, who had died when Rodrigo was 12. His mother, who had raised him alone in poverty. An uncle who had taught him the tanning trade. A sister who had died in childbirth. People who had prayed for him. A priest from his childhood who had taught him the Our Father. An old woman who had given his family bread during a famine. Strangers he had helped and forgotten. A beggar he had fed. A widow he had given firewood to one winter. They were all there, all part of the great web of grace that connects every soul who has ever loved, ever prayed, ever given anything for the sake of another. And then she saw something that made her weep. She saw his children's guardian angels standing in a circle around the bed. 4 angels, 1 for each child. And each one was holding a crown. Small crowns, simple crowns, but bright, blindingly bright. Made of something that looked like gold, but was not gold. Made of something that does not exist in this world. Teresa asked in the vision, "Whose crowns are these?" The answer came not in words, but in understanding, a knowledge that poured into her mind all at once. Those crowns belonged to Rodrigo, but they were not for things he had done in public. They were not for great sacrifices or acts of charity the world could see. They were for the nights he had prayed when his body wanted sleep, nights when he had worked 14 hours in the tanning pits, and his hands were raw and bleeding, and all he wanted was to collapse. But he had stayed awake. He had knelt. He had prayed. For his wife, for his children, for their future, for their souls, for the mornings, he had blessed his children before work. Every single morning. Even when he was late. Even when the foreman was waiting. Even when missing work meant losing pay. He had made the sign of the cross on each child's forehead and said, "May God protect you this day." For the moments he had chosen patience when anger was easier. The time his son had broken a tool through carelessness, and Rodrigo had wanted to shout, to strike, to make the boy feel the weight of his stupidity. But he had stopped. He had taken a breath. He had knelt down and explained why the tool mattered and how to be more careful. And the son had learned, not from fear, from respect. For the times he had forgiven his wife when pride told him to hold a grudge. The argument over money, the harsh words spoken in exhaustion, the mistakes she had made that had cost them. He could have thrown it in her face, could have made her pay for it with weeks of cold silence. But he had not. He had chosen mercy. He had said, "I forgive you," and meant it. For the hours he had spent in silence before the Blessed Sacrament, asking God to protect his family when he could not. Thursday evenings, after work, before going home, he would stop at the parish church, the Church of San Pedro in Peñaranda. He would kneel before the tabernacle. He would stay there for half an hour, sometimes an hour, just being there, just asking, just surrendering his family into God's hands, because he knew his own hands were not enough. For the times he had given when he had nothing to give, a beggar at the door, the family had no extra food, barely enough for themselves. But Rodrigo had given bread anyway, had trusted God to provide, and God had. For the moments no one saw, the private victories, the temptations he had resisted, the times he could have taken money that was not his, could have lied to get ahead, could have betrayed his wife's trust, could have abandoned his family when the weight became too much. But he had not. He had stayed. He had fought. He had chosen faithfulness when faithfulness was the hardest thing in the world. Every small choice, every hidden sacrifice, every quiet act of love. Heaven had counted them all. Not one had been missed. Not one had been wasted. They had all been woven into these crowns. Teresa watched the soul of Rodrigo rise higher. She saw him pass through what she described as layers of light, each one brighter than the last. And then she saw him stop. He was standing before the throne of God. She could not describe what happened next. She said the light was too much. The joy was too much. She only knew that Rodrigo, the leather tanner from a forgotten town near Salamanca, was received into heaven with a welcome, she said, rivaled the apostles. When the vision ended, Teresa was shaking. She stayed in the chapel for hours. She could not move. She could not speak. When her sisters finally found her, she was still kneeling, tears streaming down her face. One of the nuns asked her what she had seen. Teresa looked at her and said something the nun would repeat in her testimony during Teresa's beatification hearings decades later. She said, "I saw what God values most in a man. Not his strength, not his wealth, not his reputation. I saw a husband who quietly led his family to heaven, and I saw heaven rejoice over him as if he had conquered kingdoms." That testimony is recorded in the Processes of Ávila, documented between 1622 and 1625, held now in the Vatican Secret Archives, catalogued under the reference Processus Remissorialis in Civitate Abulensi. The story did not end there. Years later, in 1581, Teresa was traveling to the convent in Soria. She stopped in a small town. She did not plan to stop there. Her carriage had broken a wheel. The wooden axle had cracked on a rough section of road about 10 miles outside Peñaranda de Bracamonte. The driver said it would take 3 hours to repair, maybe 4. Teresa was exhausted. She was 66 years old. The journey from Ávila had already taken 5 days over terrible roads. She had a fever. Her joints ached. She wanted to rest in the carriage, but something pushed her to move. While the driver worked, Teresa walked to the local church to pray. The Church of San Pedro, the same church where Rodrigo had prayed all those Thursday evenings. She did not know that yet. Inside, she found a woman kneeling before a statue of Our Lady. The woman was older, maybe 45, maybe 50, hard to tell. Life-aged people fast in rural Spain. Her face was worn, deep lines, gray hair showing under her veil. She was crying softly, praying the rosary. Teresa sat behind her and prayed quietly. She did not want to intrude, but she felt drawn to stay, to wait. Something was about to happen. She could feel it. When the woman finished, she stood to leave. She genuflected, crossed herself, turned. As she passed Teresa, their eyes met. Teresa felt a jolt of recognition, not the normal kind, something deeper, something spiritual. She knew this woman, not from meeting her, from the vision, from that night 4 years before when she had watched Rodrigo die. She stopped her. She reached out gently and touched her arm. She asked, "Forgive me, but was your husband named Rodrigo?" The woman froze. Her face went pale. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. She stared at Teresa like she was seeing a ghost. Finally, she nodded slowly. Teresa took her hand. She said, I need to tell you something. Please, sit with me." They sat together in the back of the church, on a wooden bench worn smooth by generations of prayer. The afternoon light came through the small windows. Dust danced in the beams. Outside they could hear the sounds of the town, a dog barking, children playing, a cart rolling past. Teresa told her everything. She described the room, the whitewashed walls, the wooden table, the clay candle holder, the candle itself, how it had flickered, the prayer, the Our Father, the way Rodrigo had prayed each word deliberately, like he was handing it directly to God. She described the children asleep in the next room, 4 of them, 3 boys, 1 girl, the straw mattresses, the thin blankets, the cold. She described the moment of his death, 3 years after that first vision, the fever, the gray skin, the shallow breathing, the wife sitting beside him with a damp cloth, the children at the foot of the bed. The woman gasped. She covered her mouth with her hand. "How did you know? How could you know?" Teresa kept going. She described what the woman could not have seen. The angels, the souls, the ancestors gathering, the guardian angels holding crowns. She described the crowns themselves. Small, simple, bright, made of something that does not exist in this world. 4 of them, 1 held by each guardian angel. She described the soul rising, not struggling, not fighting, rising like something prepared, like something ready, like a bird that had been in a cage and suddenly the door was open. She described the joy of heaven, the welcome, the reception, the way God had received Rodrigo as if he were a king returning from war, as if he were a hero, as if he had done something extraordinary. The woman listened in silence. Tears streamed down her face. She did not try to stop them. She just let them fall. She told Teresa that after Rodrigo died, she had spent years wondering if she had failed him. She had wondered if his hard life, his lack of education, his quiet faith had been enough. She had prayed every day since his death, asking God to show her a sign that he was safe. Teresa looked at her and said, "He is not just safe, he is crowned. And the crown he wears was built by every prayer he prayed for you and your children when the world was not watching." The conversation was recorded in a letter Teresa wrote to her prioress in Valladolid, dated October 1581, preserved in the Carmelite archives in Burgos. If you value documented history from the lives of the saints like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. Now back to the information. The vision of Rodrigo became one of the most repeated stories in Teresa's later years. She told it to young fathers who came to her for spiritual direction. She told it to husbands who felt trapped between work and family. She told it to men who thought their faith was too small to matter. She told them the same thing every time. Heaven does not measure your love the way the world does. The world measures what people can see. Heaven measures what only God can see. She told them about a moment in the vision she had not shared with many people. She had seen Rodrigo's oldest son, the 14-year-old boy who had held his father's hand as he died. 50 years later, that boy was a man. He was a priest. He was serving in a parish in Valencia. And Teresa saw in the vision that his vocation, his entire calling to the priesthood, had been planted in his soul the night he watched his father die in peace. The boy had seen something that night. He had not understood it then, but he had felt it. He had felt the presence of God in the room. He had felt the weight of grace, and it had marked him. Teresa said that one quiet death, one faithful husband surrendering his soul in trust, had sent ripples into eternity that were still moving. That priest in Valencia went on to baptize over 2,000 souls before his own death in 1634. He trained 12 young men for the priesthood. He built a small chapel in a poor neighborhood that still stands today, where families gather every evening to pray the rosary together. And it all traced back to a leather tanner who prayed the Our Father by candlelight while his children slept. Teresa wrote about it in her book, The Interior Castle, completed in 1577. She did not name Rodrigo. She called him simply a humble father. But those who knew her story recognized it immediately. She wrote, "I have seen souls enter heaven with such glory that I trembled, and yet these were not the souls of bishops or abbots or men the world considered great. These were souls of simple men who had done one thing faithfully. They had loved their families as Christ loved the church, in silence, in sacrifice, in daily dying to self." That passage appears in the 6th mansion, chapter 11, verses 4 through 7. But the most striking part of Teresa's teaching about Rodrigo was not what he did. It was what he did not do. He did not preach to his children. He did not force them to pray. He did not make a show of his faith. He simply lived it, and his children watched. Teresa said she saw in the vision that Rodrigo's daughter, the youngest, had struggled with her faith as a teenager. She had doubted. She had questioned. She had even stopped going to Mass for a season. But every morning she had seen her father kneel before the small wooden crucifix in the corner of their home. She had seen him cross himself before meals. She had seen him forgive her mother after arguments. She had seen him give their last bread to a beggar when they had nothing. And years later, when her own faith returned, it was those images that brought her back. Not sermons, not miracles, just the steady, quiet example of a man who believed even when belief was hard. Teresa said that daughter became a third-order Carmelite. She never entered a convent, but she lived a life of prayer and service in her own town. She cared for the sick. She taught children to read. She prayed for the dying. And when she died, Teresa saw her soul rise to meet her Father. The reunion, Teresa said, was so full of joy that even the angels paused to watch. This is the part of the story most people miss. Rodrigo did not just save his own soul, he saved his family, not by controlling them, not by demanding obedience, but by showing them day after day, year after year, that God was real and God was worth everything. Teresa told the story to a young husband in Toledo in 1579. The man had come to her in despair. He said his wife had left the faith. His children were growing wild. He felt like a failure. Teresa looked at him and told him about Rodrigo. She told him about the candle, the prayer, the crowns, the thread of grace. And then she said something the man never forgot. She said, "You think your prayer is too small. You think your example is not enough. But I have seen what heaven does with the faithfulness of one man. I have seen it turn entire families toward God. I have seen it echo through generations. Do not despise your littleness. God is building something you cannot see yet." That man went home. He kept praying. He kept trying. And 30 years later, his grandson entered the Jesuit order and died as a missionary in Peru. Teresa's vision of Rodrigo spread quietly through her convents. The nuns repeated it to families who came seeking guidance. Priests referenced it in homilies. Slowly, almost invisibly, it began to reshape the way people thought about fatherhood. Before Teresa, most spiritual writing focused on monks, martyrs, and mystics. Ordinary family life was seen as a distraction from holiness. But Teresa saw it differently. She saw that the home was not a barrier to sanctity. It was a school, a battleground, a proving ground. And the men who fought that battle faithfully, who led their families not with anger or pride, but with humility and prayer, were building the kingdom of God as surely as any monk in a cloister. She wrote about it in a letter to a Carmelite priest in Seville in 1580. She said, "Do not tell the fathers who come to you that their work is less than ours. Tell them their work is harder. We pray in silence. They pray in chaos. We fast in peace. They fast while feeding others. We offer our lives once. They offer their lives every single day in ways no one will ever applaud." That letter is archived in the General Curia of the Discalced Carmelites in Rome, catalogued under correspondence file C/1580/047. By the time Teresa died on October 4th, 1582, the story of Rodrigo had become part of her legacy. It appeared in early biographies. It was referenced in her canonization process. It became a quiet, steady reminder that holiness is not reserved for the extraordinary. In 1622, 40 years after her death, the church began the formal investigation into her life. Witnesses were called, testimonies were recorded, and one of the questions asked repeatedly was this: what did Teresa teach about ordinary family life? Multiple witnesses referenced the vision of Rodrigo. They described how Teresa had used it to counsel husbands, fathers, and families. One witness, a laywoman named Maria Gonzalez, testified that Teresa had told her the story during a visit to her home in 1578. Maria said Teresa had looked at her husband, a struggling farmer, and said, "Your work is building eternity. Every morning you rise before dawn. Every night you fall asleep exhausted. But I have seen what God does with such faithfulness. He turns it into crowns." That testimony is recorded in the Informatio of 1622, housed in the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. The story took on new life in the 1700s. As the church pushed back against Enlightenment ideas that dismissed family life as mundane, Teresa's vision of Rodrigo became a powerful counter-narrative. Preachers used it to remind fathers that their quiet sacrifices mattered. Writers referenced it in guides for husbands. Artists depicted it in paintings that showed ordinary men kneeling in prayer while their families slept. One painting, completed in 1743 by an unknown artist in Madrid, shows a man praying by candlelight. In the background, barely visible, is a faint image of crowns hovering over sleeping children. The painting hangs today in the Carmelite monastery in Ávila, in a side chapel dedicated to Saint Joseph. By the 19th century, the story had spread beyond Spain. It appeared in French translations of Teresa's works. It was referenced in Irish homilies. German priests told it to farmers. Italian confessors repeated it to struggling husbands. And everywhere it went, it carried the same message. Your hidden life matters. Your unseen prayers count. Your quiet faithfulness is building something eternal. In 1970, during the Second Vatican Council, the Church revisited Teresa's writings on family life. Theologians pointed to her vision of Rodrigo as evidence that the universal call to holiness applied just as much to lay people as to religious. The Council's document, Lumen Gentium, echoed Teresa's teaching. It said that all Christians, whatever their state in life, are called to the fullness of holiness. It said that married life and family duties are a path to sanctification. And though the document did not name Rodrigo, those who knew Teresa's story recognized the echo. Today, nearly 500 years after Teresa saw the vision, the story still circulates. It appears in retreats for married couples. It shows up in homilies on Father's Day. It is whispered to young husbands who feel overwhelmed by responsibility, because the truth it reveals has not changed. Heaven does not measure success the way the world does. The world looks at wealth, influence, power, fame. Heaven looks at love, sacrifice, faithfulness, prayer. And a man who prays for his family in the dark, who chooses kindness when anger is easier, who leads not by force but by example, that man is doing the work of a saint. Teresa saw it. She saw the crowns. She saw the joy of heaven. She saw the thread of grace that runs from one faithful heart into the souls of children and grandchildren and strangers who will never know his name. And she saw that when that man stands before God, the welcome he receives will not be based on what the world applauded. It will be based on what only God could see. The leather tanner from Salamanca, the man who prayed by candlelight, the father who led his family to heaven without a single grand gesture. He is still there, still crowned, still rejoicing. And the lesson Teresa left us is this: you do not have to be extraordinary. You do not have to be famous. You do not have to do great things the world will remember. You just have to be faithful, day after day, in the small things, in the hidden things, in the things no one but God will ever see, because God is watching, and God is counting. And when the final accounting is made, it will not be the loud voices or the big names that shine the brightest. It will be the quiet ones, the ones who loved in secret, the ones who prayed when no one was listening, the ones who led their families to heaven one small choice at a time. Teresa saw Rodrigo's soul rise. She saw the crowns placed on his head. She saw the joy that awaited him. And she spent the rest of her life telling anyone who would listen, this is what heaven values. This is what God rewards. Not noise, not performance, but faithful, hidden, sacrificial love. In 1634, 52 years after Teresa's death, a small chapel was built in the town near Salamanca where Rodrigo had lived. It was dedicated to Saint Joseph, the patron of fathers and workers. Inside, on the wall behind the altar, someone carved an inscription. It is still there today. It reads, "Here prayed a man whose name we do not remember, but whose soul heaven could not forget. No one knows for certain if it was placed there because of Rodrigo. The records are lost. The town has changed, but the locals still call it the Chapel of the Hidden Father. And on the feast of St. Joseph, families gather there to pray for the men who lead quietly, who sacrifice without applause, who build the kingdom of God in ways the world will never see." Teresa would have loved that. She would have stood in that chapel and smiled, because she knew something most people spend their whole lives missing. She knew that the heroes of heaven are not always the ones the world celebrates. Sometimes they are just tired men with rough hands and simple prayers, kneeling in the dark while their families sleep, asking God to do what they cannot. And God always answers, not always in ways we can see, not always in ways we expect, but always, every single time. That is the truth Teresa saw. That is the truth she preached. That is the truth that has echoed through 5 centuries and will echo until the end of time. A leather tanner named Rodrigo, a candle, a prayer, a family, a crown, and heaven rejoicing over a man the world never knew.